well take a share, you're more likely to actually get more money for your economy. You can obviously argue that the other way as well. There's a big debate as to whether countries are better off. So, for example, Brazil are pushing more along the approach of we'll do it ourselves rather than bringing in international companies. So you can argue maybe that's better in the long run to develop those skills domestically. But certainly there's a lot that you can debate around the idea of whether natural resources and industries are better to be developed with foreign capital coming in and foreign money and foreign expertise, or whether in the long run you're better off doing it yourself. There's a whole debate there that you could have.
Where exactly is the link then between having like an FTA and allowing the Shell to come into an African country, for example?
Like if you sign a free trade agreement, right?
Okay.
Why couldn't you simply sign a bilateral agreement with a company or whatever? Why couldn't a government simply?
I think it's sorry, you're absolutely right, but I think it's more. These are all examples of, I suppose, an openness to international. Okay. It's not a case of I'm saying this is not a case for a free trade agreement, but it's more. These are the kind of arguments that tend to be made in favor of open trade, free trade, open economies. So it's a kind of picking at individual issues. I completely accept they're not ones that have to sit together. Yes, a country can do that, but your whole debate may be whether they should do deals with international oil companies. I've seen that happen. The other one then is it's a case of you've got a whole section of debates about whether it's good to bring countries into trade-focused bodies. So, for example, you can look at the WTO and so forth. What's been the impact on, we'll say, rights of admitting China into the WTO? Has it actually improved workers' rights and so forth? You can look at whether it was a good idea for Romania to join the European Union, whether that's actually produced, we'll say, improvements in terms of rights and conditions there, and whether maybe even the increase in the rights there has made them economically less competitive. There's a whole lot of debates there, but certainly I think from a pro-free trade side, there's certainly an argument for saying that free trade is good because by engaging with them and getting them into these sort of international organizations, you can push a rights agenda on these countries which they may not care about themselves. So that's an example of an argument.
But this kind of contradicts the first economic boost promotes rights,
yeah.
When it said that the first argument said that rights should rise from within the country.
So my point is, like, what I'm presenting to you here is not one case that I would make in one speech, but these are more ideas for arguments which you can use in different debates. And I completely agree with you, like the two of those would have a tension in terms of how they would sit together. So you either need to, I suppose, twist them a little bit or whatever it may be. So it's a case, just to clarify, like I'm not saying in every free trade debate you make all of these arguments, but it's a case of, like, as I'm saying, you may get different ones with different debates will appear where you'll have different priorities. So maybe a pure free trade debate, or that this House believes that developing countries should involve foreign companies in the exploitation of their natural resources, in which case some arguments become more applicable than others. So absolutely, I'm not saying use the whole lot of them because there are tensions, but it's more to give you a kind of an idea of some approaches you can take to debate this. Anti-free trade, okay? First thing is this, whenever someone says to you that there's all this evidence in terms of that there's all these countries which developed economically when they had open trade policies, first thing is, throw it back to them, it's the whole correlation causation thing. And basically say, like, look, yes, there is a correlation there, but maybe there are other factors at play. So for example, I think the biggest thing was that in the 20th century, there was a correlation between, I suppose, generally open trade policies and your side in the Cold War, effectively. So it's more so there's an argument for saying whether the outcome of the Cold War is something that had a big impact on whether you were successful or not, rather than just your attitude to trade policies. I don't agree with that claim, but I suppose it's a way of responding to what is quite strong empirical evidence. So, for example, there's some people would say, look, the reason why South Korea was so successful with a very open trade policy was because the United States pumped loads and loads of money into it. American companies were very pro-South Korea, I suppose, for ideological reasons, and that's why they went in and supported there, perhaps to the detriment of some other countries. So there's other factors at play. So I don't necessarily think this is a debate winning point, but I think it's something where you're seen to be engaging at that point, and it's just a useful one that I think people can make. Japan, I think, is also a good counter-argument, where you can say that Japan was a country which, yes, obviously engaged with the West in a lot of ways, following the Second World War. There was a lot of US money that flew in there as well and so forth. But you also saw that Japan protected key industries. For example, its automobile industry was very heavily protected from American competition until they were able to grow. So the question is, why is that so important initially? So I think the idea is it's a case of you've got rich developed country, you've got poor country. Business and your ability to compete is all about economies of scale. It's about getting your business to a certain point where your overheads are low enough that you can just produce at a big enough scale. So what Japan did was they said, whatever, the Toyotas of the world, we're giving you exclusive, or the Toyotas of the country, we're giving you, exclusive access to our own markets. So you can develop enough, so you've got enough critical mass, so that you can then go out and compete with the American players on a level playing field. Which I suppose, on the other hand, you'd probably like the likes of, say, the Ford Motor Company, which were much more established at that stage, and probably would have been able to go in and wipe them out in Japan. I suppose if you want to look at, for examples, if you look at what's happening throughout Eastern Europe, throughout Southeast Asia, car companies that used to exist are just being wiped out by big international competition because they just can't compete. So maybe the argument is that we needed to give those companies more time to adjust from going a very closed system where whatever Proton cars were the cars you could get in Malaysia to, and they're still quite favoured, but on the other hand now it's gone the other way where no one wants to buy a Proton anymore because Proton just didn't have that time to catch up after the markets were opened up. Protons just seem to be used by taxis now if you ever go to Malaysia. Yeah?
It doesn't oppose free trade as a principle, it just opposes it for a period of time if those companies are able to compete.
Yeah, and I think it's a case. I think there's very few people. Sorry, you're right. I would generally suggest not that you would say stand up in a debate and say we never want free trade. We don't want ever to trade between countries. But I think what you want, I think the reasonable way in which to oppose free trade is that where trade is going to happen between countries, it shouldn't be in a completely unregulated, let's just throw the doors open and anyone can come in and trade in our country. But it's about doing it in a managed way, is how I would generally oppose it, and say, particularly in the case of developing countries, they may want to protect certain markets, they may want to do certain things. So you're right to point out that this isn't a case for saying no trade whatsoever, but it's a case for saying generally the debates are for arguing for a change from the status quo. So it's a case of more free trade. You will get some analysis debates in the past, but you will get a lot of debates as well saying that developing countries should liberalise their economies to foreign investment or whatever it may be. So I suppose there's a change from the status quo. These are arguments for saying, no, maybe we want to retain some of the protections which they have at the moment, or maybe they argue we should have more protections which other countries have used effectively in the past. But yeah, I'm not arguing here for, I suppose, a blanket closing of trade. Open trade policies, there's some arguments, I'm not going to dwell on this, you can read on it, but countries which have had very open trade policies, Argentina arguably led to a massive financial crash. My battery didn't know. Argentina had a big crisis a number of years ago. There were some people saying that it was poor trade policies in terms of how they liberalised themselves to trade because of that. I'm not going to dwell on it. I think it's something maybe worth having a look at. Read a little about the Argentine financial crisis. And then you can argue then it's a case of it doesn't drive stable domestically driven development. So it's a case of if you're saying that you're a developing country and you're going to develop your economy very much, I don't agree with this argument, but I'm just going to put it out there as one that tends to come up, is that you can say that if you develop these economies very much on the basis of being client economies of the United States, they become very much then, so like producing goods just for China, they become completely at the mercy of what happens in the United States. So if the United States goes through an economic crash, they go through an economic crash. But it tends to be even worse for them, because if the United States goes through a crash, it takes I suppose the control of their own destiny out of their own hands. Because I suppose with the United States, or actually I'll give you a different example, with Ireland, we export I think about 50% of our GDP. So it's a case of when the global crisis happened 3 years ago, the Irish economy completely tanked because we were hitting a situation where we saw a massive drop-off in our GDP in a very short amount of time because trade had fallen so much. And domestic demand wasn't something that was a big enough section of our economy that it was, I suppose, that it was able to provide, I suppose, more stability in the economy. So there's an argument for saying that, yes, you may be pumping up the economy, but you're just setting it up for a crash. There's some people saying the Asian financial crisis back in the 90s was an example of where this happened, and you saw a massive crash. And I suppose big crashes tend to have very long-term effects in terms of socially and so forth. Arguably Ireland today, I don't agree with it because I suppose on the other hand you're seeing as trade is bouncing, I suppose as other economies are bouncing back up, the Irish economy is recovering very quickly. So then the debate becomes about is it better to go whatever, or is there something wrong with having very sharp? You are certainly more exposed to international economies if you are very trade dependent. Getting in very heavily into that argument, but I suppose there are certainly arguments out there that free trade is something that takes a certain amount of your economic destiny out of you. If you want to look at, for example, debates about currency blocks, there's a lot of debate going on in Europe at the moment. No one's really suggesting leaving it, but about whether the euro was a good idea or not, about whether that just led to an inflexibility in economic policy that contributed to the crisis. I'm not going to dwell on that, but there's a lot of stuff you can hit on that.
What about cases like the IMF structural adjustment policies and so on that make African countries, for instance, much more vulnerable?
And European ones. And certainly I think that is something that would come in under the, if you were going to have an op argument to the, it's good to get these countries into international organizations like the WTO, whatever, in terms of, because it advances the rights agenda, you can certainly say that it exposes them to these other drawbacks as well. That's, I suppose, getting into a fair bit of level of detail in the debate, but you're dead right, there is an argument there to be made as well. Anti-free trade. Generally, I think even if I was in an anti-free trade debate, I'd say, look, fine, if you liberalise yourself to trade, there's a lot of the time where we'll concede that you will see an increase in the country's GDP. But I suppose the argument you can make is that it's like GDP isn't everything. So it's a case of sometimes that GDP you can see will increase massively because Microsoft will have set up a big factory somewhere, but most of the profits they're making will get exported. And they may just be there with a very small presence, purely for whatever tax reasons or whatever it may be, and they may not actually they may not be contributing a massive amount back to the economy. But on the other hand, as part of the deal by which you got to get Microsoft into your economy, you may have had to, we'll say, let Western food suppliers sell into your economy, and suddenly tens of thousands of your farmers are out of work. Your GDP has gone up. You've got a hell of a lot more of your people arguably have become unemployed or whatever. You can argue that, just be prepared to argue, look, GDP isn't everything. Even if the GDP goes up, you can see things like, even if more people are employed in the long run, you can see massive social problems through an awful lot of people losing their jobs. Fine, others will find them, but that sharp a change, if it happens too quickly, countries need time to adapt. That may be why they want to have closed policies and so forth. Significant social and economic costs. Modern models of free trade. This is the other thing as well. Modern models of free trade aren't entirely fair to developing nations, particularly decision-making models. So, for example, if you want to look at the WTO, you can absolutely argue with the fact that the WTO has produced a hell of a lot more benefits for Europe and the United States, simply because I suppose they have more political weight in the negotiations in that organisation. And secondly, even the way decisions are made in that organisation are just structured against developing nations, where essentially the developed world go off, decide what they want behind closed doors, and then it's kind of quite often presented as a fait accompli. The developing world are getting better at that negotiating process, but certainly I think it's the way that decisions have been made by those bodies in the past, you can certainly argue, have not been to the benefit of developing nations. So once again, I'm not going to get into too much more detail on that, but I think it's worth just doing a Google for an article about WTO decision making and having a read on that. Next one, okay. Sanctions/alternatives to invading. I don't want to get into invading countries, but I just want to talk about a couple of things, okay? If you are kind of told, whatever, the West should act to whatever, I don't know exactly what the motion will be, it may prescribe a certain amount, a certain action, or it may say we should do something about treatment of minorities in Zandu-Zandu land, whatever it is, made up country. There's a lot of different approaches you can take. But I'm not going to, this is a slide I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. You can argue for complete total sanctions and basically just blocking off all trade to the country, a la, let's say, United States and Cuba. You can argue for targeted sanctions. The example I give there is strangely oranges, which was actually where Europe were in a trade dispute with the United States. The WTO authorized Europe to place sanctions on the United States. This was in the run-up to the 2004 US presidential election. So one of the things Europe did was that they put sanctions on oranges because they primarily came from Florida, which was a swing state in the US election. So I think you can argue that certainly it's worth, if you ever have to do a debate, think about exactly how you will do your mechanism to try and force change. So the West should force whoever to do something, whatever the debate is. But think about always,